Alright, well we finished up our conversion for our starter system for this 920 motor over to the 1000 starter system. So it's got the little puller and all that like the second gen, and it works really well. Doesn't disengage the gears, no box of rocks grinding and all that, so that's really cool. But one thing I noticed, and I'll show you here in a second on the sheet, is that the Bendix Gear and the Bendix Barrel in the 1000 actually shows that for later models like the 1100, it's a direct cross. But I noticed it's a big difference in the barrel and the Bendix on the taper of it. So let me just show you real quick what this does. It still goes bop 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 when you try to start, but this little guy right here is not letting those gears disengage, so it doesn't grind out. So if I flip it on, and I'm going to disable my ignition there so it just rotates, you'll see it goes bop 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 bop. So let me zoom in there and then I'll hit it and you'll see what it does. So my curiosity is, because the Bendix gears are different for the 1000 compared to the 1100 actually looks a little bit like it wouldn't bob as much. I'm going to take this thing apart and I'm going to compare those two, because I'm going to put the 1100's Bendix Gear and Barrel in this 1000. I'm going to see which one's better. So let me zoom in here and we'll see it bob bob bob. Alright, so we're zoomed in, got my ignition off, and so all it's going to do is just crank. And you're going to see this little guy right here, it pulls in because the force of the cylinder coming over tries to make the Bendix disengage just like it did on the Box of Rocks 920, but this little guy is not going to let it fully disengage. So let's see what this thing does. So you can see it still wiggles. When it pulls out, it's engaging the gear, but you can see it still wiggles right at the end. And it's holding that gear over, but it's still trying to pull back. So let's look over here and see why this has got me curious. Alright, so just what the heck am I talking about with these differences in the Bendix Barrel and the Bendix Gear? Well, if you look over here on the right, that is a second gen 1100's Bendix Barrel. And if you look, you can see the slope of the little splines inside. Over here on the left, that is a barrel out of the 1000's starter system. And you can see the spline is much more leaned over. So to me, what would happen is when that motor tries to kick it, it would be easier for it to kick that gear over on this one than it would be on the 1100 second gen, and that may be why they put that spline at a different angle when they released those newer models. But what's curious about the whole thing is that in the chart I put together right here is, if you're wanting to swap out a first gen to a second gen starting system, over here would be your first gen, and it's the same for all these over here. I cataloged out each of the first gens. Over here is the different models that you could swap parts to. And so like here is what I got is the 1000, and then there's a 700 that also has the solenoid. You got the later 1000, the 750 second gen, and the 1100 second gen. But what's interesting is right here, if we look across there at the blue ones, the idle gear, that's the Bendix, and then the wheel, which is the barrel on the inside, you can see for the first gen it's a 4x7, so it's an original number. But over here, as we cross over into the newer years, 84, 85, you'll see that it changes to this. But when you get to the even newer models, you'll see it changes to a 3LP. Well, in looking at the references, you can actually change the 3LP over into these intermediate models, and it should fit in looking at the literature. So that's what got me curious, is that although the angle of the spline is different, the books say that those are going to cross. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over here while we got this 1000 cover on here. I'm going to pop this cover back off, and then I'm going to put the 1100 gears in the 1000's cover. Then we're going to fire this thing up, or not fire it up, but we're going to crank it, and we're going to see if that little guy right there still does that bob bob bob. And that would be like the best case scenario for this, is to have a 1000 cover, because it was super simple to put on there. Then get you the Bendix Gear and the Bendix Barrel off of an 1100, stick it in your 1000 cover, and you'll be in great shape. So let's get set up here, take this cover off, and then we're going to swap these guys out. You'll see how easy it is to do this swap. Now, in looking at our little cross reference, all of this is the same. The little solenoid's the same across all of these models, so I don't have to take my wiring loose and all of that. All I got to do is take the cover off and swap out the Bendix gear and the Bendix barrel. Alright, so let's get this cover off here so we can swap out for our 1100 gears and see if it makes a difference. And there we go. So one cool feature about this little setup right here is right inside of there is that little pusher pin. So in order to keep all of that Bendix stuff together, what you can do is just take one of the long bolts and we're going to thread it right into the end of that joker right there. So that way when we pull our cover off, we can push against that bolt and everything will stay up in there. So with everybody loosened up, now all we got to do is slide the cover off. And now we just take our bolt loose and everything stayed up in there. So there you go. Super simple way to keep all of that from falling out is just to put a bolt up in there and then you just push on that while you're taking the cover off and away you go. So now we're in good shape. Then all we got to do is take the Bendix barrel, get the light over there, take the Bendix barrel and the Bendix gear off, and we're going to swap it for our 1100 one that's got the different slope. Then we'll put it all back together and we're going to see if it still goes bob 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 when it tries to crank. So all we got to do is slide the Bendix barrel out and slide the pin and the Bendix out, and then we get our secondary gear and our little disc. Now this gear's got to stay with this starter. There's a difference in the 1100 intermediate gear and the starter gear. These guys have to stay together as a team. If you swap the starter to an 1100, you're going to have to swap the intermediate gear to the 1100's intermediate gear. But we're not doing that. We're just going to swap the Bendix. And for the 1100, there's no spring showing, so we're not going to use the spring either. Gear on, like that. We're going to slip that back up in there. Like, and under that, we'll take our little O-ring off. So that's all going to sit back there. So now what we got to do is swap out for this Bendix. So we're going to take the pin out, and all we need to do is put our little mechanism in there, like that. Put him on. Put our fork in there. Put him up in the pinhole. That. Now we just put our 1100 Bendix on there, get him locked into the gear, put his little O-ring back on, like that right there, and without the spring, because this one doesn't call for the spring on the 1100, now we're all set. So what we got is all of the side cover for the 1000, and then we got just those two gears, the barrel and the Bendix gear for the 1100. Now, all we got to do is throw all this thing back together and we'll be in good shape. And there we go. So now we got the 1000's side cover on a 920, and then the Bendix and the barrel are off an 1100. So let's fill her back up with some oil, then we'll be ready to see if this guy works the same or if it works better about that little guy bobbing right there. Alright, so with everything wired back up and all of that, now we got the 1100 Bendix and Barrel in the 1000 case here. Got oil in it, and I tightened up those two guys that I almost forgot. So now, let's turn our ignition off and let's crank it, and let's see if this guy goes bob, bob, bob any different than it did with the 1000's Bendix and Barrel. Let me zoom in there and see so we can compare side by side. Yeah, so actually it still bobs just a little, but it's just a little tiny bit. I mean, it's less than 1/8 of an inch. So it does make a difference to use the 1100's Bendix Barrel and Bendix Gear in the 1000 setup. Alright, so now with our ignition on, we see it just barely bobs. So that's pretty cool. This may be the best setup if you're really gonna go all out and set them up. You'd have to get the 1100 Bendix and Barrel, and then you need the 1000's case here. So if you're mixing and matching, but our little chart over there tells us what we can use to mix and match to put in here. Some of the original parts can actually be used, but this looks like the best setup. So now let's see what does it sound like when we fire it up. So let's get our ignition turned on, and then we're going to give her a crank and see what it sounds like. There you go. Sounds just like normal. Spooled up, fired up, no grinding or anything like that. So I think that's probably the best case scenario if you were wanting a best case scenario. Other than that, just throw the 1000 on there and it seems to do good. But the 1100's Bendix and Barrel with that little bit of different spiral on there seems to be the best option. So it looks like they got it right at the end. Well, alrighty. Hope that helps someone, and thanks for watching.